Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final episode of the Beginner's Guide to Art Fundamentals series. For everyone who's followed along each episode, thank you so much for your support. I really hope that these videos have helped you discover new ideas or insights and establish a thought process to this whole stupid art thing. I would love to create more videos after this series, but they will be less fundamentally based and more based on my own personal opinions and personal workflow and thought process. But that's later. For now, let's get to this. The reason I wanted to end the series on composition is because out of all of the fundamentals, in my opinion, composition is one of the most theoretical and can be contorted and adapted to your preferences depending on what type of a mood or narrative that you're trying to capture. In fact, composition has almost nothing to do with the other fundamentals. You can have an incredibly abstract image that showcases practically none of the technical fundamentals like drawing, anatomy, or perspective, and you could still create a solid composition. You can even bend the traditional rules of fundamentals like value, light, and color to your will, and although your images may not come off as realistic, it will probably turn out for the better. Compositions can be simple or complex, subtle or obvious. They can also be practically non-existent, and a good image can still come out of it. I guess I should explain what a composition is, though, for those that are out of the loop. I described composition in the introduction video as the idea of constructing your image to best attract the viewer's eye to the focal point, or move them through the image in a steady flow that is pleasing to the viewer. It's also used as a narrative device to help tell the story in your image. The big question is, how do you construct an image in a way that creates a focal point or creates an enjoyable ride through the image? There are a lot of ways to go about this, and we will discuss them later on in this video. Before we get there, though, I want to bring up the point I made previously by saying composition is one of the most theoretical fundamentals. Because if you haven't noticed yet, a focal point and a guide through an image are two different concepts. One causes the eye to smoothly travel, and the other causes the eyes to have spontaneous, possibly sporadic movements placed in specific sections of the painting. You can even practice a mixture of the two, having a guide move you through the image, but along that guide is the major focal point, then finish the guide out of the image. I don't think any of those methods are necessarily incorrect. Some may work better or worse than others, depending on the situation. It's important to know, though, that whichever method you go with is only a tool to help create a good composition. Whether or not it's successful isn't always up to you. You can do all the planning and execution in the world, but sometimes compositions will impact people differently than others. In James Gurney's book, Imaginative Realism, he discussed a test that was performed with the folks at iTools Inc., a company that has the technology available to track the central eye movements of subjects. The test revealed a lot of interesting information that can help inform our decision-making as artists when creating compositions. It discovered that people's eyes generally move in very jagged, unpredictable movements throughout the image. That tells us that neither a solid focal point nor a line leading from one end of the image to the next is the way people actually perceive our images. In the tests that were done, which I recommend you take a look at the articles James Gurney wrote about the tests, you can find them on his blog for free, gurneyjourney.blogspot.com, or by Googling James Gurney eye tracking. You can see the test subjects didn't even enter the image at the desired focal point. They entered into an area of the image that was near the top center and bounced around from section to section until they felt they saw enough. However, the eye hovers, and the area that the eye hovers in are generally around the people or characters in the painting. Whether or not there was anything implied in the composition to guide people to those characters or not, subjects generally hovered around the people or creatures because of the natural draw that humans and animals have to look at something familiar, especially something with a recognizable facial structure. But this information doesn't suddenly dismiss the concept of focal points or guiding the eye. I viewed many images that without needing any more than a second knew that there was a nice, graceful loop or guide through the image, and it just felt right. It wasn't distracting, but I probably didn't follow it too closely either. It was used to help inform my brain on what the hell I should be looking at. And that's all composition is, really. Things that we can do to our images to make people's brains go, ooh, look. So with all that being said, let's get into how we can make people's brains go, oh, it looks so pretty. All right, focal points. So although we now know people tend to not just immediately be drawn into an image at whatever your desired focal point might be, there is still that concept of hovering over something that the brain sees as important or interesting. That's why focal points are crucial. Before we go too deep into this, let me quickly explain what a focal point is. Focal points are designated areas of interest created by the artist as a way of attracting attention from the viewer. Pretty simple and straightforward. If your image is of a character, focus on the character. If your image is of a character doing something, focus on the thing they're doing. Those are some pretty straightforward guidelines. They can be broken, of course, but it gets a little more ambiguous when your image is maybe of a vista or of a group of characters. Most artists will tell you that you want to really maintain one major focal point for the viewer to hone in on. So if it's a vista, maybe there's a section of some mountain range that's catching the sun just right. Or if it's a group of characters, there is one stepping forward out of the crowd, possibly the leader. Let's dive into the different ways of attracting people to a particular area though before I get too ahead of myself. Value. Using values is probably the easiest and most commonly seen way of trying to influence the viewer's eyes. Areas of high contrast naturally are attention grabbing, especially when in relation to areas of low contrast. Here are a few examples of this method being used. The idea of contrast is something that you will probably be hearing often in this video. Not just contrast of values, but contrast of anything. Small versus big, light versus dark, busy versus simple. The idea of contrast is what attracts people to particular areas. By using contrast to your advantage, you can create a solid focal point in every image that you make. You just have to know where to use that contrast. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself again. I just wanted to preface all of this since you will be hearing this concept used a lot in this video. Back to values. So just because high contrast means people will look in that direction, that does not mean your main focal point should only be tons of really dark areas combined with tons of really bright areas. It means in relation to the image, it would probably be better suited to use a higher amount of contrast in that particular portion. Forgive me if you haven't watched my values video yet. $5 now on Gumroad? Oh my gosh, that's a steal. What? Whoa, what is he, man? Is he really selling that for $5? You gotta be kidding me. Anyway, but in that video, I discuss how I use a scale of 0 to 10 for my values, each number being a percentage of the value used, 0 being white, 10 being black. And I'm going to use that same type of method when discussing things here as well, so hopefully you can follow along. Let's say you have an image that is a mixture of 50% to 60% grays. It's a very value-controlled image where you are extra cautious of your decision making. That doesn't mean that you would then make your focal point something that is made of a pure white and an 80% gray, for example. You very well might be able to do that and pull it off, but I'm just letting you know that that's not what you are restricted to. There are so many ways you could go about it. You can have your focus just be a value-controlled light figure. Change the background values to be 80% gray, but then have the focal point be a 50 to 60% gray. When it comes to contrast, it's not always insanely bright or insanely dark values that is what's going to get your way. In fact, it may even do the opposite and make your image look unpleasant. One of the biggest mistakes I see young artists do is they try to add a lot of contrast where they want people to look, but it ends up looking off-putting or kind of amateurish. And even someone who doesn't know anything about artwork would be able to tell something just doesn't feel quite right to them about it. Most of what we have discussed here has been talking in very simple terms of silhouette. It's not completely necessary to block in the entirety of a figure with a single value or grouping of similar values just because you want that figure to be the main focus. Values is very closely tied into lighting, and lighting can drastically change how we perceive someone or something. Lighting is generally what you will probably have to consider the most when establishing an image and thinking about where the contrast and values is going to come from. However, in every evenly lit scenarios, like overcast lighting for instance, you may need to use contrast in the local values of the subject or scene in order to attract that eye to that area. All of this is assuming you're going for realism with the atmosphere and lighting. Now, let's assume that you aren't going for realistic lighting. Let's say if there were a pyramid of fundamentals that lighting was actually lower than composition. That would mean regardless of if it would look more realistic or not, you could bend the rules of values in whatever way you would like. Any given image that you could use heavy value control that might not look the most realistic, but would be more visually striking. Two artists who do this very well with their work are Anthony Jones and Brahm. You can see in the examples by these two how they control the values and commonly organize them in their own categories of light and dark. The middle range of values are mostly dedicated towards shading the light side so that it will still remain in its own graphic value shape and not bleed into the darker values so easily. You can see an example of this graphic value shape being used in the previous image of a character that I put up just a bit ago. You can see how all of these local values contrast with one another and are at different sort of value scale levels in order to move the eye towards those areas of higher contrast. Brahm and Anthony Jones do this very, very successfully in their work. Although there are benefits to values that bleed into one another, but we'll discuss that in a later portion of the video. Anyway, this is all just lengthy discussion of me trying to reinforce that idea of contrast in your values and how you can use that to draw the eye. How you use values is entirely up to you. It could be with the local values of a particular subject, or it could be using some form of lighting to help your focal point pop out. Either way, it is definitely something to explore and consider when working on your images. Silhouette or shape. The next category for helping establish a focal point is a bit of a broad one. I realized when researching this portion that it can be used in a number of ways. Silhouette is essentially a silhouette. It's the outer contour shape of a subject. Another way of thinking of this is just the general shape of the subject, whatever that may be. Could be a character, animal, landscape, etc. Silhouette is a great way of making the viewers perceive something instantaneously, especially if the silhouette is an easy to identify one. That's why silhouette is so important when designing characters or creatures, but that's for a future video. So it's pretty easy to imagine that if you had an image with a single character, making sure that the silhouette is strong and easy to read is pretty important to maintaining that focal point. However, it can be used in other ways. Like I said, the concept of contrast will come up a lot in this video, and silhouette and shape have an amazing opportunity for creating contrast. Imagine an image that is filled with circles on a grid, but in a small section of the image there's a triangle. Where do you think that your eyes are naturally going to gravitate towards? Probably the area that's different. You can use this concept of contrast in so many images. You've probably seen it used tons of times in games or movies as well, without even realizing. A scene full of people that all look very similar, but the protagonist or antagonist stands out amongst the crowd because their silhouette is so different from the rest. You can see in this example that it's not just a good contrast of silhouette, but it's also a really good contrast of color between the blue in Daenerys' clothing and the skin tone of the surrounding people. You can see this concept being used in the sketch I've done here, where I take only rounded, organic-looking shapes and contrast it with a rigid, inorganic shape as the focal point. The other way that silhouette can be used with contrast is with grouping. Let's go back to the circles example. Imagine an image with a mass of circles all huddled around each other, then in a section away from that group resides one lone circle. This grouping is a great way of using contrast of silhouette to your advantage, and if you combine that with the actual subject matter silhouette, it can be even more powerful. So instead of a lone circle, you could have a lone triangle. That would make the fact that the triangle isn't a part of the group even more apparent and naturally draw the eye in that direction. The first example that I gave when discussing silhouette was just having a strong single silhouette. I do think it's important to emphasize that sometimes contrast isn't always an option with every category, depending on what it is that you're painting. You may not have 100 other subjects in your painting to then help pop your one crazy character out of the crowd. However, you do have to make sure that the silhouette you create is a clear one when thinking about your focal point. Nothing is worse than seeing someone attempt to establish a character as the main subject matter, but you can't even tell what they're doing because the silhouette is so strange and confined. I'm not trying to say that you need every character to have this crazy over-the-top silhouette, or even that they need to have any of their limbs popping out to make sure you know what they're doing. That's not what I mean by strong silhouette. What I mean is based on the subject matter, the mood that you're trying to represent. What would be a clear way of depicting this character? If the character is pointing their finger and yelling at someone, then yes, probably have them break out of their silhouette a little bit. But if they're shy and contained, or even wanting to go for an unsettling look like this scene from A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, then find a silhouette or shape that would best represent that. Also, that movie was pretty dope and creepy. I liked it. We will discuss the theory of mood and shape language later in the video. Alright, let's move on to color. Just like the values and silhouettes in a painting, color can be used as a resource to attract the eye. We can bring that same idea of contrast into this category as well. If you haven't watched my color tutorial yet, which you should, it got like a 9 out of 10 on IMDb's user reviews. That shit is ridiculous. Anyway, whatever. I talked about some of the major subcategories of color. The ones that I think are relevant to focal points would be hue, saturation, and color schemes. A quick rundown of each of these for you so that you understand what I'm talking about. Hue is what color something is, i.e. it is red, orange, purple, etc. Saturation is the purity of a color or the lack thereof, the least pure being pure gray. And finally, color schemes are common patterns of color based on whatever your particular color wheel is that feels naturally pleasing to the eye. Common color schemes are red and teal, green and purple, orange and blue, etc. So if we took these 3 portions of color and used them in a way to attract the eye with contrast, it could be used in a variety of ways. You could create a fully desaturated image but make the focal point saturated, or you could use a contrasting color scheme like a complementary color scheme. A complementary color scheme are any 2 colors directly across one another on the color wheel. So if you had a very blue image and then had an orange focal point, the contrast between those 2 colors would attract the eye towards the orange. And of course, you could reverse this and have a very orange image with a blue focal point. Either one would work really well. You don't always need to rely on color schemes or contrasting colors though. Creating contrast isn't always just using complete opposites. It's creating tension by having one thing that is just different from whatever is near or around it. So if you had, let's say, an analogous color scheme, which is a color scheme using a variety of colors near each other on the color wheel, you could organize the colors in a way to create contrast where there would normally be very little. Let's use blue, teal, and green as an example. Let's say that you have an image that is primarily made of blue with some indigo here and there. But where you'd like the focal point to be could be a splash of green surrounded by blue. That way it consists of 2 colors furthest from one another, and by not using green anywhere else in the image, you've isolated it and made it felt special or different. There are just so many ways that you could mix and match colors to reinforce your focal point. So combine that with values and silhouette, and you have the potential for a very, very solid readable image. Edges. There's one more thing I'd like to touch on before we move away from basic ways of establishing focal points, and that's edges or edge control. I almost, admittedly, forgot to add this into the tutorial, and that would be bad. That would have been really bad. Edge control is something a lot of artists have troubles with, me included. The concept of edges is generally used as a way to give focus to particular areas of an image while leaving other portions softer and out of focus. You see this all the time in film. A camera will be within focus of a subject, making them crystal clear, but the areas around the focal point will be blurred and softened or out of focus. This method can be very useful for giving focus to a particular subject. However, it can also be easily unbalanced or chaotic. As always, I feel like I need to mention that everything I'm about to say is a suggestion. There are no good or bad ways of using edges. In fact, edge control isn't even necessary for creating a good image or even establishing a focal point. As long as you have excellent value control, your edges won't need any controlling because the values will be leading the eye. Personally, I feel that edges are more of a cherry on top for establishing focal points. It can look very nice in a final image and will only emphasize what you've already established with your values, color, and your silhouette. That's why images like graphic posters work so well. Everything maintains a crisp edge, but the other major ways of establishing focus carry the weight, leaving edge control unnecessary. With all that being said though, edges can still be used to your advantage and should be understood at least at a basic level. There are generally 3 types of edges: hard, soft, and lost edges. Hard edges would be your crisp, defined edges. That's generally where you would like the eye to focus on. These edges can be on the edge of a silhouette or just crisp edges being created by the lighting scenario or forms of the object in the image, whatever. So whether it's the edge of a teapot or the crisp highlight within the teapot, either way the edge is crisp and eye-catching. This doesn't mean that you should be lasso tooling every single section that isn't focus. Just like everything else in this video, there's room for contrast here as well. An edge can appear more hard when it is surrounded by edges that are softer than it. So no, you don't need to spend hours making sure that these edges are perfectly crisp. Just make sure they are crisper than the surrounding edges. Soft edges are where the eye can gradually skate across. It's not completely devoid of information, but it's clearly information that is less important than what the hard edges are giving us. These edges, or variations between hard and soft, would probably be what makes up the majority of your image depending on how much you want to abuse edge control and use it to your advantage. Finally, lost edges are edges that are so soft they are almost indistinguishable between one form and another. These types of edges are great for giving the eye a complete rest from the information being provided by the balance of your hard and soft edges. Lost edges are areas of the image that are so useless to the overall subject matter being presented that it can blend seamlessly into another form and your eye wouldn't even really notice it. Lost edges are probably one of the tougher things for new artists to grasp and implement into their work. A huge habit of people first learning about edge control is to create a lost edge of a light value that fades into a dark value. And while yes, obviously you can do this, more power to you, but it's a very unrealistic perception of edges. Lost edges are usually perceived when 2 similar value levels encounter one another in the image. This is because when 2 values of a similar level are together, the amount of contrast is so low and we can easily gloss over it. This is why values trump edges almost any day, I think. However, what edge control allows you to do is take those two similar values, ideally they aren't the focal point or any area crucial to the storytelling of your image, and blend them together so seamlessly you don't even see the separation between the two. I mentioned earlier that edges can become chaotic, and usually that happens from a poor understanding of where specific edges should be placed. If you have a lost edge near the highest point of contrast, then yeah, it may be fun to play with that stylistically, and I would never say no, don't do that, you're wrong, but from the traditional point of view, that wouldn't be a great place for a lost edge. A very easy way of thinking about all of this, although I hope you experiment further on this idea, is that edges sort of radiate outwards from the focal point. The focal point will have the crispest edges, therefore the portions of the image furthest from the focal point will have the softest. This is a very basic way of thinking of it, and I don't think it's the greatest way to practice edge control, but it's something to at least get your brain thinking more about the crispness of your edges. Now, up to this point, I've been talking about edges in the way that primarily has been focusing on hard or crisp edges being the contrast to soft edges, and having the hard or crisp edge be the focal point. Now, the alternative to this is that because we're artists and we can abuse we can abuse any tool however we want with composition, we could actually have our focus be a soft edge and contrast that with surrounding hard edges. I believe that a lot of Bobby Chiu's work, you can see this. He puts a lot of emphasis on the soft fuzziness of his creatures or characters and surrounds it with generally crisper edges to just emphasize how soft and fluffy they are. So, those are all of what I believe to be the main, I guess, simple ways of establishing some sort of contrast and creating a focal point within your image. That doesn't mean that it's the only ways that you can do that, and I really encourage all of you to go out there and do your research and explore with your paintings to try and find other ways of establishing contrast. I do think it's important to do a bit of a recap here and show a simpler way of viewing all of these different ideas of contrast. Contrast with silhouette. So, like we talked about, and you can see in these two examples, is that whether you have a circle being the usual shape language and the triangle be the standout, or the triangles being the primary shape language and the circle being the standout, no matter what, you're having two very different competing shapes that are going to create some sort of contrast with one another and create a focal point of whatever is the one that stands out. Contrast with value. In these two examples, you can see that one has a darker value surrounding it with a lighter value in the center, and a lighter value surrounding it with a darker value in the center. You can organize values in so many different ways, it's crazy, in order to obtain whatever amount of contrast you want in order to really hone in on that focal point. Contrast with hue. So this goes in line with color. Okay, so hue is the first part of the way that you can contrast using color. It doesn't mean that, it's the only way. So you can see in these examples that there's surrounding red or blue in the center, or surrounding blue with red in the center. Now these are pretty drastic hue shifts, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be this drastic. Like I showed in that example with the analogous color scheme, is that you can have only a slightly different hue, and because it's contrasting and it's different from the surrounding hues, it's going to stand out. Contrast with saturation. So this is an example of having it be no hue shifting whatsoever and only having one color or one part of the image lose its purity. So we have on the left fully saturated image and then less pure saturation in the center, and on the right we have no purity, very, very small amount of purity in the surrounding circles, and then a fully saturated circle in the center. Both are perfectly fine at establishing contrast and a focal point. And finally, as far as the simple ways go that we've talked about in this video, we have contrast with edges. On the left, we have a completely soft image with a very crisp focal point in the center. On the right, we have nothing but crispness, and in the center, we have a very, very soft focal point. Both, again, are creating contrast and drawing the eye towards a specific part of the image. So please, I encourage you, look into other methods beyond these. Look into other ways that you can establish contrast, and I encourage you to start implementing this into all of your images. Thumbnailing and guiding the eye. I hated thumbnailing. Like, seriously, for so long, I really I really despised thumbnailing. And I would watch a lot of artists on live streams be able to just whip up these crazy cool images in just like an hour or less with this super solid composition. And I would be so upset with myself that I couldn't do the same thing. I would try and churn out images with no thumbnail process, and they would usually start like okay, but then I'd notice that something was off. So I'd change it, and then another thing, and then another, and you can see my point. I changed a lot of shit, basically. Finally, probably after a couple of years of refusing to believe it, I realized thumbnailing was actually a good process. It's not necessary, but whenever I finished an image that began with a thumbnailing stage, it would always be noticeably better than one that didn't have a thumbnailing stage. It was because of all of those oh shit moments where I would have to redo something or move something to fix the image were done when the image was a little bit larger than your average post stamp. So not only did I get my paintings done faster, but I also made stronger images as a whole because I made myself a plan for them. Everybody needs a rough draft at some point. Sure, eventually you could be good enough to not need to do thumbnails and you could just be a frickin' beast with a stylus pen or a paintbrush and knock out a beautiful painting like it's nothing. But that takes a lot of practice first. It takes a lot of practice evaluating and applying compositional knowledge to your images. And you will get more practice from that if you start making yourself do a number of smaller sketches before jumping into the final. Generally, I'll do my thumbnail process traditionally in my sketchbook with pencil, maybe use some grayscale markers to get an idea of the lighting or values, but mainly I'll just use pencil. Then, when I have a few I like, I'll upload those onto my computer and open them up in Photoshop for some refinement. I still keep them fairly rough so I don't commit too much energy to any one idea and get attached to it. Nothing is worse than just kind of feeling like you should go with an idea just because you spent more time on it. Once those are established, I generally have narrowed it down to either 1 or 2 final sketches. It's rare there are 2 I really think are evenly matched at this stage, but it happens. From here, I will do a rough color pass on them, and boy do I mean rough. I mean, I figure out nothing but the color scheme in this stage, and maybe do a little value work on top of that. The saturation can vary just so much in my final that I don't really bother worrying about that, just primarily what the local color of certain things will be and how much the lighting will affect those colors. And by this point, I've probably found the image I want to move forward with. Yes, it took me 4 to 5 hours just to decide where I want the image to go, but now there is almost no guesswork. I know where the color pops will be, where the focal point will be, how I'm attracting the eye towards the focal point, etc., etc. I do want to mention this is my process in a perfect scenario. A lot of the times, because of deadlines, I'll have to skip some of these stages in order to save time. And you know what? The images usually turn out for the worse because of it, but not always. We all have our moments where things just kind of click, or they naturally flow into this really nice piece that you pulled out of nothing. It totally happens, and some people it may naturally happen more so than others. I'm not a thumbnail preacher. Everyone will find their own process over time, and it will be completely unique to them. But if you're starting out or early on, I really do encourage you to try and experiment with thumbnailing and test the planned images versus the non-planned ones. You'll more than likely notice a positive difference, at least in the composition. And that's why I wanted to briefly talk about thumbnails, because it's a great segue into guiding the eye. This is a great time to remind everyone how theoretical composition is. Nothing is set in stone, and there are so many ways to construct any one image. When I talk about guiding the eye of the viewer, I believe there are 2 major ways that it can be done. Either you can draw attention to your focal point with lines, objects, silhouettes, etc. through a method called spoke wheeling, or you can guide the viewer through the focal point in what Andrew Loomis referred to as an eye pathway. The eye pathway method is one that takes the concept of silhouette or line and molds it in a way that would cause the eye to pass right over the focal point or circle around the focal point before being then led off of the image. Either one of these methods are technically viable and can even be used in combination with one another with the right planning. The spoke wheeling method is possibly a little bit more blunt and straightforward, though, whereas the eye pathway should be handled a little bit more delicately and can't really be tacked on at the end of an image. Ain't nothing worse than seeing someone just paint up a cool character in a cool pose and then remember there needs to be a composition, so they add some sharp rocks in the foreground that point up at them. Like, it's fine to try and make some kind of a composition like that, but it's usually just best to plan things out just at least a little bit better. Now, the idea of creating a line through an image is also essential when establishing a composition based on a specific shape. Some of the most popular compositions are based on simple shapes like triangles, circles, or diamonds, just to name a couple. Compositions can be thought of in a graphic sense, using basic silhouettes or shapes to help the viewer identify what they are seeing. Or it can be with line, like we just discussed. Either way, whether you are viewing something as an overall graphic shape or as a series of lines meant to guide the eye, the feeling or mood is expressed based on how those lines or planes of the shape's silhouette interact with one another. Which is why the next segment of the video I want to discuss the concept of mood through shapes. Just like with lighting or color or with dynamic drawings, mood can be expressed with composition as well. It's not all just about finding a focal point and making sure that it's established well with values, color, etc. I'm sure most of you have seen somewhere online the use of the rule of thirds, and I'm sure most of you have heard other artists praise the use of this method as a way of assuring a good composition. Well, I'm sorry to say that it's not exactly the case. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the rule of thirds is essentially a grid you can place on top of your image that divides it within 9 squares, or alternatively, you can think of it as 4 crossing lines that create tension points at 4 corners near the halfway point between the edge of the image and the center. The reason so many people use this method and recommend it to beginner artists is because it gets your brain thinking about 2 things. 1, creating a focal point and placing it not directly in the center, but not too close to the edge. Not that it's bad to place the focal point in the center, it's a common habit of a lot of beginning artists. And 2, getting used to the idea of developing your image in a specific pattern, because the rule of thirds isn't just there so you can place the focal point along one of those lines or intersection of lines. It can be utilized further by following the patterns of the lines to guide the eye towards the focal point using spoke wheeling or the eye pathway method that we discussed. What's really important is the establishment of some type of a shape in your image, some pattern to follow. Because whether you realize it or not, your brain has a natural reaction to seeing basic shapes. Whether it's because of how they've been established with modern signs, or because of things that we have seen for thousands and thousands of years. I think the best example of this is the use of triangles. Triangle compositions are incredibly common. It's like so many people do a triangle composition, which is fine. They're often seen as like powerful or imposing. A lot of the time you can see it combined with like a strong character or even heavily religious imagery. I personally believe that the reason for this is because there are so many things in nature that represent this shape in our subconscious. Mountains, trees, the Great Pyramids, all things that are much larger than us, something that is immovable in our minds. Of course, this is still all theoretical, but the subconscious is a pretty strong thing. From the small amount of convention experience that I've personally had and all the convention artists that I've talked to, a very common thing you'll hear from people, or just know based on their reactions, is that they love a specific image, but they don't know why. Yeah, maybe it's the colors, maybe it's the values, or maybe it's the shapes that their brain is seeing and screaming in their ears saying, "Look at this shit! It's a triangle! We like triangles! Buy it!" Now, I'm going to go through a list of some of the most common ways that you can compose an image. As always, I have to mention, this is not the only way that you can compose an image. There's so many ways you can do it, all right? But these are some pretty common shapes that people use when constructing images. Circle, triangle, cross, radiating lines, diagonal, silhouette with dark versus light or light versus dark, depending on how you structure your values, centered, repetition, grouping, S-curve, and balance scales. Now, I want to look into a couple of these shapes more in depth and talk about the emotional impact that they can have on our subconscious. Now, if we look at some other basic shapes, you can pretty easily workshop some ideas as to what kind of feelings that they would evoke. We've got squares, which can represent sturdiness, strength, possibly some kind of orderliness or staleness. Most objects we see in real life that are square-shaped are generally man-made, therefore it gives off a feeling of inorganicness, especially when in contrast to a more organic shape like a circle. Circles can make you feel calm, serene. Think of things like the moon, the sun, orbs, materials that curve like water or waves. Then you start to get into more ambiguous shapes like spirals, diamonds, trapezoids, or even octagons. Some of these will give similar feelings to the three major shapes of circle, triangle, and square, but can appear a little bit more dynamic or give a slightly different impression depending on how it's represented. Speaking of spirals, I think this might be a good time to mention the golden spiral. For those that don't know the golden ratio or the Fibonacci spiral, golden spiral, etc., whatever you want to call it, it seriously has so many names, it's ridiculous. It's basically a mathematical equation that is more complicated than I would like it to be. But that's alright, because we're artists. We don't need to know that. We don't need to know no math. That ain't why we got in this. We want to draw or we want to paint things, so we'll stick to that. But all you need to know is that many people believe that because the golden ratio is this perfect combination of numbers placed or divided in such a way that it's this ultimate compositional tool. And while yes, you can use the golden ratio as a basis for your composition and it will probably make a pretty good image, that doesn't mean it's because it's this amazing sequence of equations. Most people won't notice how perfect of a spiral it is, but they will notice it's a spiral. And spirals naturally make our brains get sucked into something. If we were to use that concept of familiarity bringing our subconscious forward, spirals are often seen in nature as tornadoes, hurricanes, whirlpools, or even just the use of them with hypnosis is something that is so common, at least in cartoons and junks, not sure about actual hypnosis. All things that cause this gravitational pull inwards. And I think spirals can have that same effect when used in an image. Whether it's a spiral like a golden ratio spiral or a different set of shapes or lines forming a spiral, I personally think it will give off a similar impression to the viewer. Combine that theory with the idea that when using the rule of thirds, your focal point will naturally lean to one side of the canvas and not be directly in the center, and bam! You got a spiral with an off-center focal point, aka the golden spiral. For all I know, which is not a lot, I'm totally wrong and the golden ratio is actually this amazing end-all of compositions, but if I were to guess with my big dumb brain, I'd say golden spirals ain't nothing. So what am I getting at with all this? Well, I'm saying besides the obvious touches you can do to the focal point of an image or even the application of some type of a spoke wheeling effect or eye pathway, there are even more things to consider when developing an image, and that's just how do you want someone to feel when they look at this? What shapes make us feel happy, sad, energized, etc., and how can we implement them in a way that almost tells the story without needing to tell the story? It can be through large, overarching shape language, or it can be more subtle and be with shapes scattered throughout an image that all combine into that one cohesive narrative. Shape language can go even further than what I've touched on here today, but I think for starting out, just some of those basic concepts should be enough to get you started in thinking more about the use of shapes in your work. Tangents. I'm sure after watching this video, if you're new to the majority of these ideas, you will feel overwhelmed. It's only natural. I hope you take all of this slowly though. Trying one new technique after the next, over time you will be able to combine them and implement multiple ideas into one image seamlessly. However, if you aren't careful, introducing too many concepts at once can cause your image to become cluttered with varying shapes, edges, silhouettes, chaotic values or colors, etc. And when your image becomes cluttered, the chances of you developing tangents will increase. See that segue there? It's pretty slick. Tangents are points of tension in an image that distract the eye. This tension is usually caused by two lines or objects bumping up to one another or lining up with each other. Tangents are usually hard to spot at first, but once you see it, you can never unsee it. However, some things that are traditionally considered to be tangents can theoretically be used as a compositional tool for guiding the eye. This is entirely up to the viewer's opinion though. But first, let's look into the different forms of tangents. There are some wonderful examples of the different types of tangents that were created by a comic artist named Chris Schweizer. Sorry, Chris. You can find these examples by going to his blog, curiousoldlibrary.blogspot.com, or you can Google Chris Schweizer, and you should be able to find it that way as well. Tangents. Chris illustrated and described the main tangents as the long line, parallel, the corner, the bump up, and the directional. There are other forms of tangents he described that are more suited towards comic artists, so if you're interested, you should go check out his blog. Most of these tangents are pretty self-explanatory given the names that Chris was nice enough to associate them with, but I figure we can go through them anyway. I will just summarize them though, and if you're interested in Chris's thoughts, I highly encourage you pay his blog a visit and that you read through his thoughts. The long line. The long line tangent is when one object runs directly in line with another one. It comes across as an extension of the object instead of two separate shapes and is confusing to the eye. The parallel. The parallel tangent is when two lines or objects run parallel to one another. Pretty self-explanatory. This flattens the image and removes that sense of three-dimensional space you may have if you properly foreshorten one thing in front of another. The corner. The corner tangent happens when one line or object intersects within two other lines that are colliding. This usually will make some type of an awkward, weird arrow shape. The bump up. The bump up tangent is when two lines or silhouettes line up or bump up against each other. It can be touching or very close to touching to give the strange pinching effect that creates tension in the eye. Again, this is a habit artists get into when they are afraid to create proper foreshortening and have objects confidently intersect with one another. Directional. Finally, a directional tangent occurs when two lines or objects have some form of space between them, but end up flowing in the same direction regardless. This one is tricky because it can be seen as a way of guiding the eye like we discussed earlier, but it's easy to avoid if you shift the silhouettes of things just ever so slightly to where they don't create a perfect line, but instead imply that same flow through the image. That last tangent is actually a great example of how tangents in a strange way can be used positively. I mean, they imply awkwardness, containment, they're just uncomfortable and distracting a lot of the time, but if your image is supposed to be uncomfortable or awkward, it can be used kind of as a weapon in your artistic arsenal to help emphasize the emotion in your image. Not only can it be used to bump up the specific emotion in your image, but it can arguably be used to purposefully draw attention to a portion of the image. Tangents are commonly spread about as bad practice, and while I think that's primarily true in most cases, there are some cases that I think it can be used in a way to actually grab the attention of the viewer and emphasize the focal point instead of distract from it. I think one of the more recent, widely spread uses of this was in the Force Awakens movie poster. There's a section in the poster where Kylo Ren's lightsaber and Rey's staff line up perfectly, something that would cause most people with a traditional art background to very quickly facepalm when they see it. However, you can't deny that that is one of the first things you look at in the image. Whether it be the tangent or the lens flare smack dab in the center is entirely up to you, but I remember this use of a tangent being a hot topic amongst some online art communities because it's so strange to see something like that used purposefully, at least in something so large as a movie poster. I do have to emphasize here, this doesn't mean that you should do this, but it does mean you should be open to trying new things, experimenting with things commonly seen as bad practices. Think to yourself, well, why is this a bad practice? And see if you can somehow use it to your advantage in a way and make an image work within that bad practice. Art has no rules, damn it. Anarchy. All right, let's talk about how to study. Studying techniques. Let's wrap this up. Let's wrap this all up by talking about some great ways to study and learn composition. As always, I'm a huge advocate for good old-fashioned studying. That involves some level of a master copy, learning from someone who you want to emulate, maybe not entirely, but at least a specific portion of how they do their art. Then evaluating what it is that you just copied by either jotting some notes down or going back over your final study and making some immediate mental notes. And finally, biggest thing to do here is applying it all onto something from your imagination. I want to reiterate my thoughts on this method one more just because I recently saw another large post on Twitter that got retweeted some thousands of times that basically preached the word of reference, stating that you should absolutely take a shit ton of reference and use it, because it will for sure make your images look, quote, better and more realistic, unquote. I'm not here to shame anyone that does so. I absolutely use reference when I believe it's necessary to do so, and I would never judge or shame anyone who does use it or even relies on it. Everyone has their own methods. However, I do believe that this is a discussion that can't just be handled in 140 characters, Twitter. Okay. Yes, reference is something that will inform your decision making on an image and make it generally more accurate. This can go for stylized work or realistic. However, if you don't understand the basic fundamentals that make up that reference, then it really won't help you in the long run. And more often than not, will only emphasize the flaws in your work due to the referenced portion of your image being an informed decision, and other portions being less informed or not informed at all. I've seen many professional level artists whose work varies widely depending on the subject matter because some of it is referenced and some of it isn't. However, if you already have a basic understanding of anatomy, or color, or light, but you're having trouble with a particular section of the image, That reference that you take won't need to be a one-to-one copy like you see many beginners do. People who already have a grasp on the fundamentals will be able to warp reference in a way that suits the image best and won't appear off in comparison to what they've not used reference for. I know this has little to do with composition, since composition is the underlying structure and flow of the image, and the reference part comes later, but it's the method of practice that I use that I feel like a lot of people misinterpret. So please, use reference if you need to, but try to be aware of what you do and don't understand about a specific fundamental. Things we can learn from studying others. Well, less learn and more like stealing? Sure, why not? I've totally stolen compositions before. Like here's one I stole. Hell, I even took the same idea of the flow of this image and I pitched it to a friend as a paint over on his image. He loved it, and now that painting is one of his top selling prints at conventions. And it's stolen, sort of. Not really. He did the painting. Composition stolen. Different story. This, of course, is a pretty blurred line. I've seen people that have done practically straight rip-offs of other compositions and called it their own, and I don't particularly support that. But there are tons of ways you can get inspired from other people's compositions. For that previous scene I mentioned, it was because I'd never seen a flow like this in an image. The awesome sweeping curve upwards was so powerful to me, I had to try it out in my own image. Of course, the way I did it was so much different based on my colors, values, and overall content. It wasn't a massive crowd of people, it was just a single character, so this type of researching for inspiration of a type of flow an image has is a little simpler. This just comes from really finding images you love, like really love, and finding what it is that you love about it. Is it the anatomy, colors, values, or is it the composition? How can you take that inspiration and apply it into your own work? Now, the more practical way of studying composition is really just taking the basic principles of theories I had mentioned in this video and applying it to your own work. Start implementing basic things like the rule of thirds or the idea of contrast to emphasize your focal points. It doesn't take much to start trying these techniques out, and they can even be done in a quick daily speed paint if that's something that you're kind of interested in trying out. Now, obviously studying from some master copies of artists you look up to can help. I think especially if you go into a study with a mindset of learning something specific, it will definitely help. If you just start copying some old master painting, you can potentially get overwhelmed or lose sight of why you were even studying it. You don't want to get caught in a loop where you think just because you are copying a lot of images and painting them, that you're somehow learning anything from it. Try to be aware of where your head is at when studying this stuff. If there is a painting that has dramatic lighting and contrast to help guide the viewer's eye, then please study it, copy it, absolutely. But that doesn't mean the drawing needs to be completely accurate, or the rendering, or even colored. It should, and I encourage a big should here, be studied with basic flat values in order to stay on task and learn only the most essential information. That doesn't mean there isn't more to learn from this image, but it means you are 100% focused on learning that very specific thing that you set out to learn or practice. But otherwise, composition is pretty easy to practice. It's not easy to master by any means, but starting to practice it is as easy as just thumbnailing your next image before jumping straight to a large rough sketch. It's as easy as laying out the rule of thirds over your next image and considering the placement of your focal point. No matter how you end up applying this knowledge to your work though, it all still has to be done. You still gotta put in them hours and rack your brain on each image trying to problem solve for a better looking composition. You're going to go through a lot of shitty images to get there, but don't worry, we all have to go through that. Just stay vigilant and remember to have fun with it. Not every image should be a masterpiece. Thank you everyone who purchased these tutorials. Seriously, it means so much to have all of your support on working on these. This has been a long time in the making, so to see so many people get excited about the information that I have to regurgitate out there is incredible, and I just am so appreciative of it. And thank you. I have to give a huge shout out to my moderators on Twitch, Clint and Cameron, who the two of them for every single one of these of this series of tutorials gave me feedback and watched it and told me what needed to be adjusted so that whoever purchases this tutorial, got the best bang for your buck, so to speak. So thank you guys, and thank you so much for purchasing this tutorial. I plan on making more in the future. And so please follow me on, all the different social media websites. I'm sure on one of them I will talk about future plans on what my next tutorials are going to be. So thank you so much.